Okay, this is a recording of the final lecture in the course, so this wasn't relevant for any of the assignments, exams, or anything, but in case you want to watch this again just for interest or you are looking for those ties again to phonology. So this is just a presentation of McCarthy and Friends 1990. And what they did in the paper was they tried to show that prosodic morphology is a better alternative to templatic morphology, neither of which we've really seen. Well, we've seen some prosodic morphology last week, but not in this capacity. Now, this is mostly a paper in phonology, in my opinion. At least that's the tools that they use. So we're not really going deep into the argument for these McCarthy prints. We're really just going to show the two analyses, compare them, and take away content from it rather than actually reading the article in full. So we'll look at Arabic verbs, how to produce them with the CV tier, we'll do some syllable and rule-based analyses, and then highlight some interesting points. So Arabic is interesting because their roots are just consonants. And each of these sets of consonants have different meanings. So KTB means right. And then we introduce vowels to give inflectional information. So is it an active sentence, an imperfect sentence, a passive sentence? So for example, and I'll have to do some creative on the fly stuff, which I had to do in class too. But I need to move these up a little bit. There we go. Okay, so let's say we're doing the KTB sentences and we want to do a word like right. So we say that the verb itself has a CV template. So the perfect active has a form of CVC, CVC in this case. So we align the consonants and vowels on separate tiers. So we would put, say, KTB up here, and then we put our vowels down. So for the perfect active, it's just the letter, the vowel ah, so A. Now each of these tiers are linked separately. So K goes to C, T goes to C. What's going to happen is T is going to link to both C's to get a lengthened consonant, and B connects to C. Now, on the vowel side, ah is going to connect to V, but this V needs something in it. So what's going to happen is ah is also going to spread over to this V, and our output is going to be KA, should use the right A, T, it'll be lengthened, so we'll just write two T's, and then the A will show up again. If we compare this to the perfect passive, the second line here, the vowels are U and E. So we can set this up in the same way, KTB, UI. We'll do the same linking with the consonants, but this time each of the vowels can get a different link to the V's. So both vowels are retained and we get KUTTIB. And that's the perfect passive or right. The imperfect active would be the same way. So here it's just A and I, KTB, and you can probably see how to link that. So that is an original analysis of Arabic verbs. But we can actually do this with the syllable. We can do it with prosody, so higher than the sound tier. So we're going to introduce this thing called the Mora. And the Mora is specifically used for determining what are called light and heavy syllables. So for example, the syllable on the left is a light syllable. It has one Mora in it. So this is like between the V tier and the syllable tier. Moras are only assigned to things in the rhyme. So that's the nucleus and coda. So these initial consonants, these onsets, are not getting Mora. So Arabic allows three different types of syllables, only three. There's a light CV, there's a heavy CVV, and a heavy CVC. So really there's two that we can think of. There's a CV, and then there's a CVX syllable. These are heavy, these get two Mora, so the consonant and the vowel, sorry, yeah, consonant and vowel, not in that order, will each get a Mora. So one Mora is light, two Mora are heavy. So kutib can be analyzed as a sequence of two heavy syllables. So before we just had the CVCCVC template with KTB and then U and E, but we can take a look at this in terms of its prosody. So what we can do here is we can say we have K at the beginning, we have U as part of the rhyme, so we can give that a Mora. We said it's two heavy syllables, so there has to be something that looks like this. What do we know as well? Well, the T tib has to at least appear in the onset of the next syllable. And the I, of course, will be the nucleus, and then the B is going to get the remaining Mora. So what do we do about the T? Well, this is an interesting case where the T is picking up a Mora from the previous syllable, but it's also acting as the onset of the next syllable. So really, we don't need to do this. We could just write, like, say, two T's and connect it there and there. But it's the same sound in the end, it's just being lengthened. So we use this sort of sharing analysis here. But this is how we can do the Moraic structure, the syllable structure for this verb. So we see two heavy syllables, a heavy one there, and a heavy one there. So a CVC and a CVC. Okay, so there's some processes that happen related to meaning and phonology. So let's take a look at these. So we have a case where we have yakulu and yakulna. It's not the correct pronunciation, that's just how I'll say it here. Now, what we see is that if we just add u, we retain both of these u's. But if we add na, one of the u's disappears. Now, why does this happen? So I'm not really going to show the initial form, I'll just show the second one. And here's the original analysis. So it's CV, C, V, V, C, V. Is that correct? Sorry. Let's just draw the Moraic structure without worrying about the CV tier. So we have a light syllable to start. It's getting ya. For the next one, cool na. Remember the original form had two U's in it. So in the original form, there was like another U there. So what's actually happening here is that we get a heavy middle syllable because it had two U's in the original form. Now we have LNA. Now here's a problem because in Arabic, you can't start a word with L. So this is our final form, or our, well, not our final form, but the initial form of the word in our brains. So how do we end up with a case where it just ends up as ULN? Well, what happens is that it tries to save the consonant. So it doesn't want to delete the consonant. So what happens is it gives one of its mora to the L instead. So that way it can exist. Now, the reason this can exist is because it started as a CVV heavy syllable and it changed itself to a CVC heavy syllable in order to save that consonant. So what this is proof here is that in this language, you can exchange heavy syllables for the sake of morphological or morphophonological processes. In the case of yakulu, we don't need to do this because we have a light syllable, we have a heavy syllable, and then we have another light syllable. So there's nothing that needs to be saved. Now, in contrast, we have this process called lengthening, and this is an interesting one because it seems to contradict with what we just said in that it wants to save the consonant. But in this case, we have a consonant being changed to a vowel. So this is like a CVC syllable is going to be changed with a CVV. Both are heavy. So we can do some exchanges there. We can't exchange a heavy with a light. That's not going to work. But this heavy to heavy can work. So if we do this analysis, what we end up with in the original is something like this. So two heavy syllables back to back. We have and thar. So what happens here is instead of having this second consonant, it gives, sorry, can't delete that. It gives that mora to the vowel. So this becomes a CVV syllable now, so nothing is hosting the consonant, so it gets deleted, and we get our lengthened word. So Ah, far. So it might seem as though there's no real motivation here, because why would you delete consonants and save them in other cases? But that's not really the point. That's an explanatory reason behind the scenes that we're not concerned about. What's interesting is that it shows that heavy syllables are interchangeable and that there is a distinction between heavy and light syllables. Because there's no case where you're going to go a CVC to a CV or a CVV to a CV um, for these purposes. So these things won't happen. You cannot interchange heavy and light syllables, but you can interchange heavy ones for processes. So what I'll say is that if we just use rules, it gets complicated. We need to say there's some deletion and some position, and then a vowel is lengthened. So there's two processes. This is different. This is one process. This is just more reassignment. Furthermore, it shows that two processes that sound completely contradictory are related to each other. So the fact that we can shorten vowels and the fact that we can lengthen vowels as well, it's really can be shown with the same underlying process. It's just a syllable change. But if we think about other rules and think about how we'd set them up in phonology as a rule for lengthening and a rule for shortening, there's no connection between those at all. So with the prosodic analysis, we can actually see a nice connection between these two processes. Okay, so the next thing to talk about here with words is a minimality constraint. So we saw this with English nicknames. And now that we know about heavy and light syllables, we can say that English syllables for nicknames have to be heavy. Otherwise, it doesn't satisfy the requirements of being a nickname in English. It's too short. So in Arabic, to form any word, you need to have at least two mora. So in the case of sea here and vulture and kitab, there are at least two more in all of these cases. There's also this extra condition about this it's called an extrametrical syllable. And because these words require a consonant at the end, if it can't fit into a heavy or light syllable, we introduce a new extrametrical syllable to host it. This will not have any more associated with it, and um, it's there for other purposes. So to sum it up, if we do any conjugation or affixation, this R becomes an onset, this Z becomes an onset, or this B becomes an onset. So it's really just setting up the syllable for future conjugation. Now there's a problem because some words exist that only have one mora, and there are not too many of these in the language. There are a very limited amount, and we can give reasons for why each of these exist. So the first set are called non-words. And these can be described by saying these are non-lexical. These are not nouns, verbs, adjectives, or adverbs. So non-lexical categories don't have the same conditions as lexical categories. Lexical items require two mora, just like English nicknames require two mora. But other words are not under that same constraint. There are terms called biliterals here. So two consonants, some have one mora, some have zero. But these are a very limited amount of words. So this is not exceptional enough to prove that it does not work. And the final one with imperatives, these are commands, usually in English. So the underlying form, for instance, it comes from LWY. It comes from WD in this sound. It comes from KTB. These words originally had two mora. But then through some deletion, mora have disappeared and we end up with our imperative forms. So this is why that's okay, because it came from a form with two mora, and actually you don't normally say the imperatives just as they are there. Apparently, this is their words, not mine. I can't verify this, but you would have some conjugation with those words that make it have two mora when you pronounce it. So these exceptions are not cases that are going to trouble us. So, using the concept of minimality and the prosodic theory, let's take a look at why some forms require something else. So, there's a perfective form for the word rely, that's wathi. And there's the Masdar form, which is like a verbal form. Um, so like a verbal noun form, I should say. Like the like the weight, I guess, compare weigh and weight. It's sort of more like a noun form. So in the perfective, you have wathik, and in Masdar, you get thik at. But what's interesting is that this is a feminine suffix. And there's nothing feminine about the form, it's just a feminine suffix, but it needs to be there in a lot of these words. So why is that? Well, if we think about the Moraic structure of the original word, wathik, what we would end up with is a mora on a mora on u, and then we'd have this extra metrical consonant at the end. But this meets the requirements of two mora. Now, if we just do this bit, once there's deletion on wa, we end up with a case where we don't have two mora. So what do? Well, we introduce something to get another mora. So this is where this extra metrical syllable now takes Q as its onset, and then we add the suffix at in order to get at least two more to satisfy the minimal word constraint. And now this is a valid output for the Masdar form. So in morphology, why, if we just think about meaning or morphological processes that don't involve prosody, how could you explain this? How could you give a reason as to why these forms need a feminine suffix? It's just about the need to have a minimal word form, and that's related to the heaviness of, well, the total heaviness of syllables in there. You need at least two more. We also see this evidence in borrowed words. So these are words from English on the left, and they were borrowed into Arabic. So if you have a word like bar in English, bar, and we think about how this is in Arabic, if we just did bar, and this A was short, we would end up with one more on the A, we'd end up with nothing on the R, so it would not meet the minimal word constraint. So we need to have a heavy syllable, so we just introduce two mora, and now it becomes longer, but our condition is satisfied, and we get the Arabicized form, Arabicized form, whatever those two words are, but kind of like Arabicized. Sounds cool. Anyway, that was it as far as most of the content. So this is just sort of a summary of what they did. So they took a look at all of the root patterns in Arabic and categorized them for how common they are. So having three consonants, a triliteral root, so like BHR, BDL, to and so on, are the most common by far. Having four consonants is also fairly common, but cases where you just have two different consonants are a little bit less. So B and R, S and B, J and D, and these account for only about 10% of the words, while three consonants or more account for the rest. So overall, they found 5 separate patterns for syllables in this language. So every single word can be every single verbal root can be fit into one of these 5 patterns. What's interesting is they found that some templates are more common than others. So a CVC template is less common than a CVVC template. What's interesting too is that this is less common, and most of these forms are derived from another form. So the CVV form, katib, the active participle, comes from the finite verb katab. So these forms are mostly derived forms, while these are actually roots in the lexicon on the right, the CVVC forms. So how are these formed? Well, there's actually different foot structure to this. So when you have an entire word as a foot, so with the CVCVVC structure, it doesn't get a heavy syllable until this bit right here. It is light up until that point, and this will be extra metrical. So the entire word ends up being the foot here. But for the derived forms, what's happening is you get your heavy syllable right off the bat, and then there's some extra bits after the end. So we have two heavy syllables here, and the word could technically be minimally formed by that point. So there's a difference in prosody there. And there's a little rule to show this. So you take a syllable, you add a mora to the first one. And that's how you get CVV. So here we go, CV, CVC, and it becomes CVV, CVC, and you get this by adding an extra mora. So we can actually explain the two different templates and how to get the derivation just with feet and prosody. So interesting. So there's two bases. Here's the next summary. This is basically just showing how everything is put together and all the different conjugations. So these are the four forms you get. These are the base forms, and here are the list of all the conjugations. So I don't have anything else to say about that, but that's just some information for you. So in the end, that was it. Very short. My question for you really is just which do you prefer? Because both are really based in phonology, but the prosodic one I think is really interesting because it makes this nice connection between morphology and prosody. So we're looking at something higher tier, but more importantly, it explains the process of shortening and lengthening with the same means. It uses information about syllable weight to connect these processes in a way that a CVC or a CV template just wouldn't do it. So I like the prosodic analysis a little bit more. I think it's more linguistically interesting. I think it has reasons behind things. With the CV template, it's hard for me to accept any sort of explanatory reason for why this occurs because it seems less grounded in something physical. While with this prosodic analysis, there is something very physical about the production of those sounds, and there's reasons behind it. So that's my preference. I think it's interesting. That's the end of the course. That's the end of the video. I'll write a goodbye letter on Canvas later, so I won't do it here. But anyways, if you have questions, you know where to ask, but you don't have any content that's being asked about this. So any questions are out of personal interest, and I'm more than happy to talk about that with you.